Hello everyone, and welcome to our Week 3 review on the Contact and Colonization PowerPoint. Beginning of PowerPoint, question number 1, what advantages might Spanish colonies have gained by incorporating aspects of both Spanish and Indian cultures into their society? And a lot of people brought up the point from the PowerPoint here that Spain usually seemed to be the most successful in the areas in which case they were able to kind of find ways to incorporate traditional American Indian society and practices and culture into their ruling styles. For example, in the Incan and Mexica Aztec empires, they were able to kind of intermarry into prominent families that had already lived there and kind of created a much more kind of combined class. Remember, there was that real kind of hierarchical power structure within these colonies based upon kind of how close you were originally to pure Spanish origin, but there were a lot of people and a lot of children who would grow up to be adults who had influences from both American Indian culture and Spanish culture working at the same point in time. This meant that there were a lot more intermediaries when there were disputes that could be arise between American Indian groups and Spanish groups, and it gave kind of a general more understanding of cultural elements. Not saying that the Spanish were necessarily looking for that or that they were any more open to that than any more kind of other European colonies might have been, but it was just kind of the natural process of acculturation, which happens when two cultural groups come into living in close proximity to one another, and when there are children of both cultural groups growing up in this kind of society. These are just kind of things that naturally happen. And even if you look at kind of the Latin American societies of today, you'll still see a blending of various Spanish and American, more traditional American Indian practices. Even if you look at the worship of Catholicism, which is still prevalent in many Latin American countries, is practiced in a relatively different way than it's practiced other places. On the local level, you can still see very much vestiges of kind of more traditional American Indian practices, traditions, festivals, things like that being incorporated into Catholicism and Christianity, and those results kind of impact and have impacts even up until the present day time periods. So some interesting things to keep in mind with here, that kind of the close proximity and the mixing of these two groups could ultimately lead to quite a few benefits for the Spanish. And ultimately, the French are in the same position too for question number 1, where they are able to very similarly have a much higher mixed population, and that ultimately ends up serving kind of to, as time goes on, foment better relations between the French and American Indian groups than what we eventually see end up happening in the case of Great Britain. Question number 2, looking at the different depictions of Pocahontas and how accurate you think they are, and if they can tell us anything about the myth of Pocahontas versus the reality. Now, I was hoping this question was going to refer more specifically to these kind of visual depictions. It seems like a lot of people took it more as just a depiction that I had in the slides up above of more of kind of the history aspect, which is fine. I was still giving you credit for that. But some people did a very good job of specifically looking at these various depictions of Pocahontas and trying to let us know what they think. Most people said that, hey, they're depicting her as being much older than she actually was, which certainly kind of leads itself all the way up to kind of the modern Disney interpretation of Pocahontas as certainly not being originally a 12-year-old or 11-year-old girl when she first meets John Smith, being much older, and how, of course, the romance stories kind of get mixed around from there. Also, a few of you did a really good job pointing out the fact that in a lot of these depictions, Pocahontas seems to be depicted as a white woman, or certainly not someone who looks like a traditional American Indian. And this is really a process that we see occurring several times throughout history from this period going forward, that typically when someone from European descent or eventually from American descent wants to depict an American Indian individual that they like, that they have a good connotation of, they tend to generally paint them or depict them with more white or European features. Typically, if they want to present an American Indian individual who is less friendly to white or European interests, they will depict them as looking much more like a traditional American Indian. Sometimes this has been termed as whitewashing in the depiction of these individuals. And I think you can certainly see a process of this going on here with Pocahontas, where oftentimes, because we have a general favorable interpretation and depiction of Pocahontas within our kind of history, she's being depicted a lot of times as being kind of with much more European features in a lot of these drawings than otherwise. Certainly, at least from that standpoint, the Disney picture does do a relatively better job with that depiction, but certainly the age is kind of still a variance there that you can take into account too as well. But overall, I thought everyone did a very good job of trying to kind of reconcile the differences between history and the mythology that's grown up around it, as well as somebody doing a very good job of looking at these depictions of her and saying, you know, there might be something a little bit more going on here and why they are so varied and probably not overly realistic to the individual that we're actually talking about here. PowerPoint question number 3, do you consider the story of Thanksgiving to be more of a myth or reality, and how does this form your perspective of the holiday? So a lot of people pointed out the problems with Thanksgiving, how it was a more or less relatively recent invention from the Civil War, how the Pilgrims not get added until later, how there's relatively few historical documents that would suggest that such an event occurred. But that, you know, there is still the possibility that these both groups were celebrating kind of harvest festivals around the same time. There could have been a mixing and a coming together. But typically the way that it has been presented to American audiences, as far as the Pilgrims either giving thanks to American Indian groups for helping to support them, or to just sharing Europeans' good agriculture with American Indian groups, is almost entirely probably incorrect. We kind of really see moving forward in the PowerPoint from this time period what kind of the real relations were like between these very earliest European British colonists and American Indians, and that if a celebration of kind of a combination of these two groups did take place, it would have been much more a aberration than something that typified the history. And a few people brought up some really good points as far as this can be a very problematic thing, because if this is the only aspect that we kind of focus on around Thanksgiving, we're still kind of perpetuating this myth that things really weren't that bad at this time period, that these two groups got along to a degree much more than they actually did, and really in some cases trying to cover up what we talked about in PowerPoint question number 4, the real reason why tensions grew and occurred between these two groups was oftentimes because a lot of the hostility, racial tensions, and kind of the perception from a religious standpoint on the part of Europeans that American Indians were kind of these threatening trespassers, and made it pretty much allowable then for them to pretty much take over the land which the colonists themselves thought was kind of given to them by God and so forth. And we're kind of mixing the two answers here, but I think they definitely do kind of lead into one another. And that was, in a lot of cases, kind of one of the main areas of conflict between American Indian groups and English colonists. It was how the English colonists saw the American Indians, and of course then the end result was with the English colonists, they ultimately wanted land, right? That's one of the things that really kind of separated the English colonies from the Spanish colonies or the French colonies. This idea that the English were really always looking to expand, have more farms. They brought many more families over with them with a larger population, and increasingly wanted to push American Indian groups farther and farther west. And this is a process that begins during this time period and really shapes the relations between the two cultural groups moving forward. And really by the time American Indians realize that this process is going on, the English populations had just become too high, and they were outnumbered and at a disadvantaged position in order to really effectively strike back, and that it wasn't until kind of this process had already begun that occurred. Also, just we talked about in detail last week the fact that these plagues had just gone through really destabilized the political systems of a lot of these American Indian groups, made them in a very disadvantaged position to form alliances and strike back as a cohesive unit against these English colonists, whereas English colonists could increasingly kind of have a common cause with one another to continually push and put pressure on American Indian groups to gain and gather more and more land from them. Going on to PowerPoint question number 5, then what were the main differences that you noticed between the Spanish, French, and English colonies, and do they share any similarities? I thought you all did a very good job of pointing out some of the main differences, what they were ultimately after. The Spanish were oftentimes, really focusing on material wealth in the form of gold and silver and hard metal resources. The French were looking for trade networks and trying to get as many furs and natural resources in that sense back to Europe. And the English were much more interested in having large permanent settlements, which is where, and as well as kind of an increased religious separation between the groups that were coming to the Americas and the groups back in the Old World. So really a very different motivation for colonizing in the New World. And ultimately you see, going back to the last question, how that ended up impacting the relations that each group was able to form with the American Indian peoples that they were encountering. Do they share any similarities? Yeah, and some people point out some very good similarities that they were able to share as well. Kind of the process that they use as far as engaging American Indian groups very early on, that was relatively similar. The fact that they all first kind of were able to gain their own kind of strongholds and footholds on the coastal areas and on sort of the eastern coastline, and then were able to kind of tentatively move farther west. So certainly some similarities as well, but I think kind of looking at the way the colonies develop, whether it's the Spanish, the French, or the English, really comes down to kind of those two main sequences, what they were after and how they related to the people who were already there. All right, so from there I'm going to go ahead and talk about the discussion questions from this week, looking at source 2.2 and source 2.3. So in source 2.2, that's the one that was really looking at the excerpts from the proceedings of the English colony in Virginia, kind of asking you how this document portrayed the Black Legend, this idea that kind of Spain was a lot more brutal and destructive to American Indians during this time period, and this was kind of an idea perpetuated by the British. You can see that depicted very early on if you just look down in the first paragraph there, where at one point in time the author says that such daring, treacherous people, to others unpleasant, that we washed not the ground with their bloods, pretty much talking here about American Indian groups, nor showed such strange inventions in mangling, murdering, ransacking, and destroying as did the Spaniards, the simple bodies of those ignorant souls, nor delightful, because not stuffed with the relations of heaps and mines of gold, nor silver, nor rare commodities, as Portugal and Spain's found in the East and West Indies. Once more, this is on page S2-5 under source 2.2. And really, they're saying, once more, perpetuating this idea of the Black Legend, that the Spanish had come in and kind of created and committed all these atrocities. But it's very ironic how the author then proceeds to spend most of the rest of the document lamenting that the Spanish had been so lucky in finding these very rich areas and taking them over. And you really get the sense that had the English found areas and empires with a large amount of gold and material wealth, that they would have been just as eager and just as willing to go in and conquer the American Indian groups that they encountered as the Spanish had. Of course, that's one of the big things. He's kind of trying to use this as an excuse to why the Virginia colonies are not making the money that they should. Remember, the Virginia Company was originally created the colony to try to make money and make profit, right? This idea that if they came over to the New World, that pretty much they were going to have the exact same success that the Spanish had in their colonization process, finding these large empires with a lot of material and mineral wealth that was going to enrich the company in this case, and of course Britain as a whole. And that ultimately is not what ends up happening. English as a whole, I should say. It was still England at this point in time. Great Britain had not yet been formed. But that being said, yeah, you can really kind of go ahead and pick out a number of examples where he is continuously complaining about how lucky the Spanish have been, and really how the Virginia colonies had to work with much less resources. For example, the next paragraph, third paragraph on that same page, but those had fruitful countries, had been savage and barbarous and ill-peopled as little planted, labored, and manured as Virginia. their proper labors, it is likely would have produced as small efforts as ours. So pretty much saying, had the Spanish landed where we landed, they would be having the same problems that we had. And essentially the problems which he is referring to here is that they are not able to take advantage of and exploit the American Indian populations as much as they had wanted because the American Indian groups did not exactly have the resources that they were looking for. That's really what he's complaining about here, and pretty much proceeds to do so through the rest of the document. And that really kind of sets up the rest of the tone, right? Another example, we found only an idle, imprudent, scattered, ignorant knowledge of the gold and silver and any commodities, and careless of anything but from hand and mouth, from the baubles of no worth, once more complaining that pretty much the American Indian groups, they occurred to not have gold and silver for them to steal. And even up to kind of the very last passage, yet we cannot but lament that is our ill fortunes to end when we had only learned how to begin and forthright course on how to proceed. Pretty much saying that perhaps if they had more time or were in a different situation, they would have had more success, but that ultimately wasn't the case. So pretty much trying to excuse away their misfortune here, or excuse away their lack of success or profit here as kind of the misfortune of their situation, which really I think kind of is the question number 2, goes towards the tone and content of the narrative. But a lot of people point out a lot of those very good quotes throughout there and explain them in a very good way. And really just the fact that you certainly get the sense that the British, even in this document, were not necessarily having any more positive viewpoint of the American Indian groups, and likely were going to try to exploit them just as heavily as the Spanish had they had the resources they were looking for. Really kind of undermines that idea of the Black Legend, that the Spanish were somehow worse and treated American Indians to a harsher degree than the English did. And certainly if we look at the history from this time period going forward, we can really see that that is true, and that a lot of the same things that the Spanish are doing, the British start doing the same thing. Even though they're no longer looking as much for gold and silver, they kind of, we talked about this throughout the PowerPoint, begin to shift and want more and more land from American Indian groups, which ultimately becomes just as problematic and just as devastating. Going on to source number 2-3, looking at John Winthrop and his experts on a model of Christian charity. And once more, a lot of people did a very good job analyzing this document, looking at the relationship that Winthrop is proposing between his audience and God is really this covenant between God, right? That pretty much when God gives special commission, he looks to have it strictly observed in every article, that God is laying down these rules, and thus stands the cause between God and us. We are entered into covenant with him for his work. We have taken out a commission. The Lord hath given us leave to draw out our own articles. So pretty much saying that now that the New England colonies are forming, they're able to make their own laws, but they are still kind of forming into this agreement with God that God will help them as long as they kind of fulfill their own roles and set up a society that is kind of central to himself. I think it's very important to also take a look at the very first line of this. God Almighty in his most holy and wise providence hath so disposed on the condition of mankind, as in all times must be rich, some poor, some high and eminent in power and dignitite, others mean and in submission. So pretty much showing that there is going to be a hierarchy in this entire process, which he then goes on to outline. So this covenant which they are forming with God and the regulation of society which is supposed to be based around that is also going to be based upon this hierarchy. And this is really going back to that idea of kind of these visible saints and the leaders such as John Winthrop being the ones who are supposed to be at the head of this religious society. They're supposed to be the ones doing the regulating. They're supposed to be the ones kind of making sure that this covenant which they are forming with God is going to be upheld. He certainly makes a compelling argument throughout the document why that is important in his opinion. For example, if you go down to the last article here, that we shall shame the faces of many of God's worthy servants and cause their prayers to be turned into curses upon us. till we be consumed out of our good land and whither we are going. Kind of saying that if they fail to live up to this covenant, they're going to be very greatly shamed. And from there, that there's kind of a lot riding on this. And another reason why pretty much he is purporting for the fact that kind of on two things. One, that they should look out for one another in kind of a positive and beneficial way. For example, we must delight in each other, make each other's condition our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work as members of the same body. But at the same point in time, pointing out that there's still this hierarchy and there's still this structure, and still trying to find ways for people to sort of monitor each other to make sure that the rules and regulation and the interpretation of God's laws that they are interpreting and enforcing are going to be strictly enforced. So you can kind of see a positive aspect of it. You can kind of see an aspect of it that seems a little bit more manipulative going on at the same point in time. Still, it's through this process, though, of forming this covenant and kind of becoming an example to the rest of the world, which really addresses the second portion of this question. A lot of people use this within their answers, which was very good. The Lord make it likely that of New England, for we must consider that we shall be a city upon a hill, with areas of all people are upon us, the eyes, I should say, of all people are upon us. So pretty much that the world is watching, and that if this kind of Puritan organization can come together and form this, what would be, in John Winthrop's opinion, kind of perfect society around God's law and fulfill this covenant that they are making with God, that is the mechanism then that's going to be able to show the other religious groups and the Church of England back in England kind of how right he and his religious viewpoints were. Remember, that was the entire point of the Protestants moving and coming to America and forming this kind of new removed society, unlike the Pilgrims who wanted to completely separate themselves from the established religious organizations. John Winthrop and the Puritans really wanted to break off, form their own society, and kind of become an example for the rest of Europe. And in that way, really trying to kind of show, particularly the establishment in the English church, that they were doing things the right way, and that by conducting themselves in this manner, fulfilling this covenant, they really saw as a way to fulfill this, and in that way kind of become a New England in North America, kind of an example of a better England, so to speak. And even though this was written very early on in our colonial period, I think the sentiments in it really get carried on to later colonial thinkers as well, where there was always this idea that the government systems, the religious systems, and the kind of social and cultural systems which were being developed in America or in the British colonies in the Americas during this time period were somehow better than those in Europe. They were newer, they were fresher, they were better, they were more sincere. And of course, eventually this is going to get transferred into the political system. We'll be talking much more about that going forward. But in one sense, in another sense, you can really look at this as kind of the beginnings of American exceptionalism, where pretty much from very early time period, people want to try to be using their own ideologies, their own beliefs, and their own religious viewpoints that are occurring here in this point in time, the British colonies, eventually in the United States, as an example to the rest of the world, and pretty much implying that the rest of the world is doing it wrong and should follow suit. And that's certainly something which you're going to see continuing to be played out in a number of different ways through a number of different time periods from this time period moving forward. But I would think in all those time periods, as well as this time period, it's important to look at multiple aspects of what's going on. And as just as much as John Winthrop wanted to create a kind of perfect society where everyone held each other up and were able to kind of help each other, and he also wanted to create a society that was run very strictly around these very conservative religious principles, and that anyone who is going to be operating outside of those rules were going to be ostracized. They were going to be, particularly when we were talking about other religious groups, remember from the PowerPoint, they were going to be attacked, such as the Quakers, or driven from the community. So as much it was supposed to be kind of inclusionary and supportive to the members who agreed with it, it was still more than willing to be very exclusionary to anyone who did not fit his version of what kind of the ideal Christian society should be. So you can kind of gain some positives and some negatives from what Winthrop is saying here, and I would say from kind of the entire idea of what the Puritans and the Pilgrims were trying to do when they did come to the New World. All right, that is it for our discussions from week 3. Thank you very much. And we'll go ahead and continue on looking at week 4 next week. Good luck on the rest of this week's PowerPoint questions and discussion questions, and we'll discuss it more going forward. Thank you very much.